Good evening and welcome to Thursdays with NAMI. My name is Peg Morris and I'll be your host for the evening. I'm the Director of Programs with NAMI North Carolina. That's the National Alliance on Mental Illness, North Carolina. I'm glad you're here. Thursdays with NAMI is our way of building conversations and building community on the topic of mental health. Thursdays with NAMI came about as a way to push back against the difficulty that was being brought into people's lives by COVID-19. We found in our support group conversations and in our helpline calls, more and more people concerned about health, economic insecurity, so many issues coming up effective about March, April last year. So we started this program as a result. So many people have struggled, but some groups have been hit harder than others. On top of everything, Asian Americans have faced COVID-related bullying, discrimination, and racism. So last year, that behavior seemed to come from the top, with some elected officials referring to the illness in racist terms, the Chinese virus, Kung flu, not helpful. In 2020, the number of anti-Asian hate crimes surged a full 145% over the previous year, while the rate for overall hate crimes went down 6%. So clearly something's going on. The data comes to us from a report of the nation's 18 largest cities put out by California State University just last month. Surprisingly, a ray of hope has come from Congress. How often does that happen? Republican and Democrats came together and took action just today. The Senate passed legislation targeting anti-Asian hate crimes. Passed with wide bipartisan support, the new law will direct the Department of Justice to expedite the review of hate crimes related to COVID and establish ways of reporting them online. So that will be helpful. The Judiciary Committee on the House side is working on a similar bill. So how is all of this hitting our Asian American friends in North Carolina? And how are people coping? In just 1 minute, we'll be speaking with two leaders from the local Chinese American community, Lily Chen and Jennifer Tu. As usual, the first part of our show will be an interview with our guests. About halfway through, we'll show a video of the week, and then we'll spend time answering questions from you, members of our virtual studio audience. And first, we want to take a moment to thank our funders. Thursdays with NAMI is funded in part by the North Carolina Division of Mental Health, Developmental Disabilities, and Substance Abuse Services through the Federal Community Mental Health Services Block Grant Fund. And thanks to Ben Sound for royalty-free music earlier, which Executive Director Gary Kreitz loved. And now, without further ado, Lily Chen is the Program Director of the United Chinese Americans Youth Mental Health Collaborative called WAVES, which stands for Wellness, Advocacy, Voices, Education, and Support. She's also a nurse educator who is currently a full-time instructor at North Carolina Central University. A student of theology and medicine at Duke University, Jennifer Tu is a second-generation Chinese American and coordinator of UCA WAVES. So they work pretty closely together. Previously, she studied neurobiology at Harvard and spent a year in Taiwan as a Luce Scholar doing dementia-related research and advocacy. Welcome, Lily and Jennifer.
Hi, so happy to be here.
Thank you for inviting us. It's always a pleasure.
Absolutely, and I know this is close to the end of the school year, so I really appreciate your valuable time. And for both of you, we always like to learn about our guests, learn their backstory. So tell us about yourselves in a nutshell. And Lily and then Jennifer.
Sure. So my name is Lily Chen, and I'm a lecturer at NCCU and also a clinical scholar fellow at Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. We're doing a project. It's called the Breaking Silence, and we're trying to address the Asian American youth mental health issues, as well as another project that is being done at NCCU addressing nursing students' emotional health. Because we're doing COVID, we have observed that we all have experienced increased stress and anxiety and particularly healthcare workers or the future workers, right? So that's two of the project that we're doing. I live in Cary, North Carolina. I have 5 children, and I came from China in 1988 and got my graduate degree from University of Iowa. So I really enjoy. We moved from Chicago 3 years ago. That's why I said I have to say North Carolina, but I am in North Carolina. But anyway, so we really enjoy living here. Is I love what I do, and then my civic community work that I've been involved. The 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 project is part of the community work, and also I serve at as an outreach director for a local Chinese organization. It's called the is CAFA, Chinese American Friendship Association, and it's a wonderful organization. Has been here for 25 years, and then we did a lot of service for our local community. And also I serve, as Peggy said, at United Chinese American, which is a national coalition of Chinese Americans for civic engagement, youth development, and also heritage sharing. So yeah, that's who I am, and would love to hear you, Jennifer.
Yeah, that's a lot to follow. Lily is such an amazing leader and organizer for the United Chinese Americans and the clinical scholars. So I'm really humbled to be working with her. My name's Jennifer. A lot of people call me J2 because my last name's Tu, but
Oh, I didn't know that. Okay.
since college. But I am a second generation Chinese American. And just to clarify for those who don't really aren't really familiar with the terminology, I think first generation usually refers to people who have immigrated from outside of the US. And then I've heard of 1.5 generation, as in people who immigrate as children and grow up in the States. And then second generation, like me, being the children who are born to parents who have immigrated. So that's just like a little nugget for you. So a lot of people call me an ABC, American born Chinese. That's kind of like an older term. But yeah, I grew up in New Orleans as part of a very close-knit, quite small, but strong Chinese American community. I went to Harvard College, and I think that's actually where mental health really got onto my radar. To be honest, I was so ignorant about mental health issues and how to address them, how to cope with them on a personal level. And I think it was only when I actually lost a friend to depression when it actually became at the forefront of my mind. And since then, it's been quite a journey. To be honest, it's been very difficult. And at this point in my life, I am still an aspiring physician. I have a long way to go, but I am hoping to devote my career to mental health. And I hope to become a psychiatrist. I know there's lots of limitations to the system, and I just hope that I can offer some care and support to future patients one-on-one. And it has been such a privilege to be with the United Chinese Americans and be able to do at least a little bit of work in a community space and where people have been very supportive. And so, yeah, in the future, I hope to continue advocacy like with UCA and help bridge the gap between medicine, like more like social or even spiritual issues, and mental health care.
Well, it's wonderful. You both bring so much to the table as far as your personal experience and what you're doing professionally. And Jennifer, there's such a great need for mental health professionals, psychiatrists, culturally competent ones in particular. So I'm so glad to hear that you're choosing that field, and I know you'll make many contributions. So why don't we jump into our questions, additional questions, and Jennifer and Lily were so organized. They told me which questions should go to which person. So if it doesn't seem like they're equally distributed, that's okay in this case.
Absolutely. It's all Jennifer. It's all Jennifer. Just want to clarify. She's an amazing organizer, have a huge heart. We're just so fortunate to have her keep us organized, you know? So yeah, but thank you. Very grateful. Yeah.
All right. So the first one, how are you taking care of yourselves in this climate of racism and difficulty?
Yeah, I can start with this one. And by the way, Lily is an amazing visionary and leader and connector of all humans. So just putting that in there. So I kind of mapped this out, caring for myself in this climate of racism. I feel like everyone is so different and has different needs. One way to think about it has been the classic hierarchy of needs, starting at the very bottom, like the most basic physiological needs, then moving to safety needs, and then love and belonging, and then esteem, and then finally self-actualization. And I do think that at each of these levels, there are really important things that I found personally to my mental health, especially in this time of anti-Asian racism. So starting with physiological needs, I've definitely found that I've started sleeping in a lot more than I used to. And it's been a real privilege of doing so as a student right now. But I will say like rest and taking time to myself has been so important. Just for a restorative time every day. I think it's important to note here when we talk about physiological needs that the stress from racial trauma is not just in our heads, it is felt in the body, and that is where it manifests and takes its toll. And so it's impossible to overstate how important the physiological needs are. Moving on to safety, I am also very privileged to be a student and living close to campus, where I'm surrounded by a very diverse group compared to perhaps most communities in the South. And so when I go out, I try to stay close to campus, or I go out with friends. And also, I have to add that with physical safety is also psychological safety. So personally, I think establishing psychological safety has involved some intentional decisions. For example, I've curated my social media accounts because I'm a millennial to follow a limited number of news sources and plenty of therapists and activists who are Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And I've made sure to unfollow people or organizations that I found triggering or harmful. I've also had the privilege of seeing a therapist regularly through my university, and that has been so helpful in learning how to maintain psychological safety. I also have a primary care provider who helps me manage depression, and so I'm not shy about it. I think taking medication for any sort of mood symptoms is something that anyone should have the liberty of exploring and starting, especially in this stressful time with the pandemic. Sometimes I like to joke that they should put antidepressants in the water. Like, of course not, but it would be, I mean, it's just so much during COVID. But in all seriousness, psychological safety is crucial for everyone right now, especially people of color. Next, after safety, is love and belonging. I feel like I didn't prepare a lot to talk about with this because I feel like it's so clear for most people. But really in this time, making time to talk with close, trusted friends has been crucial. I think there was a time during COVID, like there was a month where I kind of like isolated myself because I was like, I need time to like be on my own. And that was so helpful. But I feel like it's kind of like a heart squeezing. Like I needed time on my own to like relax and like, you know, let more into myself. And then at some point I needed to contract again and like get the blood flowing, get more social contacts, you know. And along with that, I also had to distance myself from people I knew may uh, may have not understood me or may have harmed me. And that's been especially challenging for me as someone who's been socialized to be kind of a people pleaser. But I think at this time, it's crucial to choose who I can trust very carefully. And of course, the last is self-actualization. In terms of those needs, I've found it extremely helpful to draw on the work of Black, Indigenous, and people of color scholars, clinicians, as well as friends. In preparing for this interview, I was thinking like, to the audience tonight, and I have to say it is the book My Grandmother's Hands by Resmaa Menakem. I wonder if I can put it into the chat right now, but it's a really wonderful book, and it addresses white supremacy very directly, and it Mr. Menakem, he actually writes specifically for two different audiences, like people of color and white people, and they're separate chapters. And he puts in meditative practices for each person that challenge you as the reader to confront experiences of racial trauma, as well as to challenge white body supremacy and reshape police culture. So I feel like it's full of nuggets for people who want to challenge themselves to go more into activism or just to learn more for their own health and wellness. And I've talked a lot, so I'm just going to leave it at that. And I put My Grandmother's Hands by Resmaa Menakem in the chat.
Wonderful. I love that title. I love your comments about social media and making sure that we control what information is coming into our world. And yeah, so much of what you said resonated. And Lily.
How do I take care of myself? Oh, I think that Jennifer has said it all. I was just, I don't think I can say any better or more comprehensively. I love the fact that, just like you, Peggy, I was nodding as she's talking, and I think that as a women of color and also multiple hats. We're wearing multiple hats, right? It's like when you talk about heart squeezing and relaxing, and that's exactly, I think that, but at the same time, I just have learned so much from you, so much wisdom at such a young age, right? You have to chose wisely either social media or the people you're with or actually the tasks and activities that you want to do, right? So that you then have own time. So for me, I think that being in the nature that really help. I like to, walk or run or swimming or gardening. Just went to the farmer's market this afternoon. Literally, I just said I need to get away from my computer. Just doing something simple is not, just simple. And then also, I think that something that I didn't do very well is that I really, as a Christian, I think we need depends on our faith more. Like, God's words is really comforting for us. And then I should have spent more time studying the word. And that's something that I'm struggling with because there's so much to do. You wanted to do. Once you woke up, like, oh, 5:30. Oh no, it's 7:30 already. I haven't, just started working and then you started, okay, I need to do, but anyway. So I think this is something is a constant like balance and struggle that we all struggle with. But I think that and then also I think that I have been seeing therapists myself. And Jennifer, I'm so glad that you say that. But again, I think these past 2 weeks because of the just getting busy, I kind of letting it go. I said, oh gosh, I need to get back to that too. So I'm just telling you that it is great. I think that at least we're trying and it always on my mind, but not necessarily we're doing all those things we're supposed to, but just keep trying.
Absolutely. And I see more and more people talking about extending grace to ourselves and to others. And I think that's important too. I think that really came through in both of your comments. So Jennifer, actually, both of you work with students and interact with so many young people. How are they being affected?
Yeah, I can start with this one too. I am a young person, but I am technically an adult. I would say that if you if you hang out with Asian American youth, particularly 1.5 or second generation immigrants, you may notice right away that there are distinct pressures, especially the pressure to quote unquote succeed and honor your family sacrifices. And I feel like baseline, there's this distinct toll on mental and physical health, trying to meet those standards. Believe me, I have been there too. So I think that has already been there. And it is part of what a lot of people call the model minority myth. Which I'll get to later in future questions too. But I think for now, suffice it to say that young people do struggle with that on a daily basis. I do think it's also important to note here how early racism starts to affect young people. Research has shown that by 6 months, babies are noticing racial differences, and that by age 4, children have already begun to show signs of racial bias. And so I keep saying it's impossible to overstate things, but it is impossible to overstate how important it is to talk about racism and its effects with children early on. It's important to acknowledge how racism hurts everybody and how the effect of racial trauma can build over time. And so education and interventions should be done as early as possible. And parents can help by facing their own bias, learning more about history and politics, sharing that with their children, being honest about it, and serving as a role model to talk about what racial differences mean and don't mean. I will also add that in addition to my anecdotal experience interacting with young people like me, statistics also show that suicide was the second leading cause of death among individuals between the ages of 10 and 34. And yet there's still this silence, stigma, and shame surrounding the mental health issues that contribute to these tragedies. I might be preaching to the choir right now since this is a NAMI event, but children do need support from their parents and families to access mental health services like psychiatry and counseling. I do think also, since we're talking specifically about anti-Asian violence tonight, regarding the alarming behaviors among AAPI youth, first, it's important to disaggregate what AAPI or Asian American and Pacific Islander means, and to acknowledge that different factors affect people differently among groups. I mentioned the model minority myth just now, and that, just to clarify, is this supposedly positive set of stereotypes, like Asians being smart and hardworking, that actually serve to pressure Asian Americans into a very limited definition of success and work, and pit Asian Americans against other people of color while maintaining the status of a perpetual foreigner. So the model minority myth is not a compliment. It's actually a very harmful and insidious way of maintaining racist beliefs and white supremacy. Such racism is often internalized and reinforces other factors. So for youth, especially from Asian American heritage, this may look like staying silent even when someone needs help. And for parents, it could mean rushing to judge a struggling child as weak rather than listening, empathizing, and supporting them. And I will pass it on to Lily to share.
You're muted, Lily.
Thank you. So, Jennifer, thanks for your, again, I love this conversation is between, two generations, and because this really affects you, I'm sure it affects my children too. I was just reading an article on model minority from actually NCCU's research journal that one of my colleagues shared with me, and she said, "Lily, read this." So, um, she was talking about how model minority really how growing up and when she was because of the myth when she was struggling and no one was helping her, and now her son also suffer from that because they just think that, oh, you guys are all going to be great, all smart, all going to be good in math. So they were struggling, and also when they're struggling they couldn't meet the expectations, they get depressed because like something wrong with me, how come I'm not good at math. I think that myth, I mean, different group ethnicity have a different myth, that affecting them. So it definitely affects. Just I think the point of it is that we can't generalize or profile people just based on their color or their ethnicity, and so. And another point that I want to make, I just share a video, a very homemade video, is in from Montgomery County, from Maryland. One of our UC member, Paul Lee, and she's also a volunteer for our WAVE program, Youth Mental Health Collaborative. So, so if you watch the video, it's only a few minutes, and these are real testimonies of how microaggression and racism affected children to the point that I have heard actually quite a few, I have heard from quite a few people that their Asian American children don't want to go back to school because they were being bullied or they were being, and then the teacher didn't know how to respond at school, and then also the parent didn't understand because their experiences were different, like as a first generation parents, we didn't go to school here, so a lot of things I don't understand how our children experience. And then also another thing is that Jennifer, you mentioned about starting at 6 months and then 4 years. I have this from my experience that I do have a few kids, like my oldest didn't realize what she was experiencing until in college when she studied Asian American history. Entire junior high school years, she just felt ashamed about her ethnicity because she was picked on, just say, comments, I'm not saying that these comments are intentional, but the impact is the same, your eyes, your food or whatever, they internalize that, they hated being profiled and call names, and stuff like that. uh, so I would say that in even the school years, during the junior high or high school years, they just didn't have enough support, and they so that they carried that shame about, or a lack of knowledge or lack of education. Obviously, I wasn't doing a good enough job as a mom because I never knew how you affect my children because I didn't have that experience. Did you see that's why we wanted to um, focus on our goal, our program actually is focused on parent education, improve the communication between the parent and youth. I hate to call you youth, but young Asian Americans, so that we can understand each other more. But anyway, so I think that this is something that I want to share. That the last thing that I want to say is that I do have my youngest one, a high school senior. She's going to go to college soon. So in February of last year, and I don't know if I shared this or not, and one of her friends in the classroom, Asian American friends, Chinese American, started to cough, and her teacher started mocking coronavirus. So I just asked her, I said, what did your friend say? She said nothing. And I said, and then I said, how did she feel? She said, Mom, what do you think she would feel? Of course she feels, embarrassed and, ashamed and all that. So as a math, but anyway, so I used the example in one of the op-ed that I wrote to Atlanta Journal-Constitution that was published. That I used the example because this is like a real example of how children are affected by the but the pandemic. So I can share the op-ed if you're interested.
Yeah, absolutely. We'd love to see that link in the chat box, or if it's not handy, we can send it out as an email afterwards.
Okay.
And it makes perfect sense what you're saying about all those subtle things that, the intrigue with someone's hair or food that has this effect of othering them and making them feel so not a part of. And it's so crucial to young folks to feel that acceptance. And there have even been news stories about, with the world opening back up, some of the Asian students, grade school, high school, don't want to go back. And maybe you were alluding to that as well, that because of the fear of what's going on socially and how people are treating them. So a lot of moving parts here, a lot of difficult parts. All right. So recently, speaking of school, several teachers in a Texas school were in trouble because of a racist test question. How should teachers evaluate material to ensure it isn't biased? What is the litmus test?
Mm-hmm. Jennifer, would you like to share, or would you like me to share? I think you're muted.
All right, well, you can go ahead with this question. And I've also posted a link to your op-ed in AJC in the chat for attendees to access.
Oh, you did? Oh, okay. You're so fast. Okay. So I have another short one, which is called the Asian Americans Letter to the Editor. So I'm just going to share that quickly. It still is addressing the, okay, sorry. So do you want me to share about how education part, or would you like to start? I always want to hear you. And then so first, I want to hear your perspective.
Okay, sure. I mean, I had like an initial response to this question, but I know, Lily, you've done so much work with schools, so I would love to hear you talk. I guess my initial response was that the question is about how should teachers evaluate material to ensure it's not biased. And this might sound very cynical, but I do believe it's true that there's no such thing as unbiased, that every fact that is included in a textbook or a test is a decision to include it and exclude others. And so I guess this question actually points towards this bigger issue, which is how do we decide what is included in educational materials, especially in public schools, where like most of our kids are going and like being exposed to these ideas and grow up with these ideas. And how do we enforce that? So yeah, I'll hand it to you, Lily.
Yeah. As I alluded earlier before, I think the reason that my oldest daughter never knew about Asian American Chinese American history is because they were the city I used to live is in Naperville, is like a top one most friendly city. It's kind of similar to Cary, and the school district was amazing. I love the school district, but they did not teach anything Asian American history. So she thought that Chinese American history started when mom and dad came to the United States, which is 1988. I never knew that. She never knew that until in college. So that being said, I think that I always believe as an educator, right? Knowledge is power. Knowledge is power. So I'll pivot my answer a little bit. At that what we have been doing to advocate for the Asian American history being taught. So just recently, a couple of weeks ago, that the Illinois, a coalition of Chinese American in Chicago, because I also serve on UC Illinois Chicago chapter, right? Still, yeah, I know I should, but anyway, so a coalition under amazing leaders that we successfully to asked Illinois legislators to amend the bill. It's called the TEAACH. It's called the it's related to the teaching of Asian American history, that amend the bill so that the bill is going to be included entirety of the Asian Americans, in the curriculum, K-12 curriculum. So they accepted the amendment, and the bill, we didn't introduce the bill. No, we didn't. But we just took a part into making the bill more inclusive, and that's what we did. So it's SB 486 or 468. But anyway, so Senate bill. So it passed the House already. When it gets to the Senate, if the Senate passes with the amendment, the state of Illinois is going to become the first state in the country to require to teach the Asian American history in K-12 school. So that's one thing that we felt that we were, something that, that we felt very strongly about, and then we took action, So we have about 600 Chinese Americans signed a witness slip over one weekend. So that was pretty historic. So another thing we're doing is that actually, again, in Chicago, we have some amazing volunteers, organizations. They are doing the One Book, One World book donation drive. So they ask for donations. They set up a GoFundMe, and so there are already close to 15,000 donation already. They buy the Asian American book, carefully selected by the parents and also the experts. And then they are going to, there are 37 Chicago public schools already, are going to be beneficiaries. Actually, the schools also started to promote that. So, and then, so we done different things to find a solution to how then we can educate the students and public. And I think that also on the PBS, there's a documentary made. It's called The Asian Americans. And actually the PBS documentary is going to be part of the bill that is in it. So requiring the school will show that film, which is a beautifully made film, beautifully made. And then UCA has worked with all the volunteers, translated the captions, has a Chinese caption to that film. So I have all that, if Jennifer, you wanted to share. So these are just several things that we have, I personally kind of have been involved with, but there's so much more that I think our community is trying to do.
Right. I'm in the middle of a book called Lies My Teacher Told Me, Everything Your American History Textbook Got Wrong. And it's a really fascinating overview of how so many groups' histories are lost in favor of sanitizing American history. So that's a really good one to check out. I'm not all the way through it, but yeah, it's exactly what you're saying. And I think the issues we have of oppression and bullying, if we really can look at that history and understand where people are coming from, those would decrease. So while we're on bullying, have you personally witnessed or experienced discrimination or bullying? And I had that down for a Jennifer question.
Go ahead.
I unmute myself. This question, have I personally witnessed or experienced discrimination or bullying? It's a difficult question because discrimination is on a spectrum of racism. And on the spectrum of racism, there's things that are as obvious as physical violence on one side. And then there are subtler things like microaggressions on the other. It's all on the spectrum of racial aggression. And in a way, the subtler offenses can be uniquely challenging because there may be this self-questioning, like, is this a race thing or is something wrong with me? And so in terms of discrimination, I've personally experienced microaggressions from as early as I can remember. And like Lily said with her kids, I had no idea. Like my friends were teasing me at school about my eye shape and like Chinese language. And yeah, it's just something I grew up with and kind of got used to, unfortunately. And in the midst of the pandemic, I think I've gotten off lucky. I've stayed close to campus and there have been lots of international students who look like me. So I feel a lot safer. But I have had close friends across the country who have been physically attacked. And on social media, I still keep my eye on the news a bit, And so there are constant reports about violence all over the country. And anti-Asian racism is scary. I almost forgot to mention, but a few weeks ago, I was helping Lily again with another webinar about self-defense and empowerment, specifically for Asian American members of United Chinese Americans and like open to the public and everything. And while we were in the session and I was speaking, a Zoom bomber, I guess that's like the term for people who just like pop into Zoom. Yeah, a Zoom bomber came on and said ching chong and like shut up B, called me the B word. And I was just like, okay, I just kept going on. Like I was just like, I'm just gonna ignore this. But in the chat, luckily, our wonderful team was able to get that person off of the Zoom, or at least unable to speak and like have everyone hear it. But on the chat in the session, a lot of participants were like, I'm so shocked that happened. I'm sorry. And like, you didn't deserve that. And like, how awful. And yeah, I was really grateful for those responses. Personally, I just felt really thankful that it wasn't in person, that I didn't have to face that person, you know, and have like a physical threat. And I also felt like this weird sense of pity for that person who would take time out of their day. I have no idea how they got the panelist link to let them say that and like do something so hateful. Like it seems like a waste of time. And the only reward I could imagine for that is satisfying some very misguided thirst for revenge. And yeah, I just felt pity. So I guess in terms of discrimination, bullying, the spectrum of racial aggression, I just feel like our country would be so much better off if all of that animosity were directed towards dismantling white supremacy and in all areas of society, not just like our individual one-on-one relationships or our Zoom sessions, but legislation, starting with police brutality and gun violence.
Well, I'm so glad that that situation was resolved before much damage was done. I've had trolls in some of our support group meetings, and it's pretty button pushing. So I'm so glad that that didn't doesn't sound like it shook your style very much.
Nope, I was lucky, but thank you.
Good. And Lily?
Yeah. So just follow up for what you said about the webinar, right? So Jennifer was saying that actually we organize a webinar is organized by CAFA I'm sorry, the self-defense class, because again, we are very action oriented. We sense this, the reason that we wanted to do the self-defense is kind of indirectly to telling you, like in terms of our community's experience, right? So in that webinar, we did a pre-survey of 332 people who registered for the webinar. That we have over 87 to 90%, and Jennifer can share that graph, that has expressed they have increased anxiety and they're fearful about, they have increased anxiety, they feel more stressed out, that also they have affected their mental health, as well as affected their daily lives because of the racism and pandemic. So that is a very powerful data, right? So then another piece of the information is that of those people, there's about 58 people responded that have experienced the racism, physical, verbal, and other forms of racism or bullying or hate crime. Racism. Only 10% report. So only 10% report. Actually, that data is very, very consistent with the national data or the data we see. What does that tell you is that we are, I always wanted to, I think there's two points I wanted to make. Number one is, as a community, model minority myth, we are perceived as hardworking, obedient, um, silent, just kept silent. So we have been really, and our culture encourage the collaboration and no conflict, no confrontation. That's our culture. They emphasize or cultivate, right? So then we are, again, I don't want to like say every Asian Americans, but this is what the culture or quote unquote expected of us anyway. Sorry. So historically, we don't speak up, even though we wanted to speak up. Due to language barrier, like I said, it's hard when you make a report when there's no language support. That's an extra barrier for you. So they're not going to report, right? So there's all these structural barriers there to prevent someone from report. And then on the other hand, or not the other hand, or the second point I want to make is that just think of how difficult it is to prove a sexual harassment or rape case, right? So it seems like, sometimes I feel like, I just read a book, it's called Know My Name by Chantel Miller, right? It was just an incredible book, and the difficulties, that she has to go through, and even of the system of, a variety of issues being exposed that I have never experienced in the full scale how difficult it is. Like the system is victimized, it seems like put all the burdens on the victims. You got to prove A, B, C, D, E, F, G, you have to prove all that before somebody can be held accountable. Just think about such a, the governor of Kumo, Governor Kumo. You think if 5 or 6 ladies step up, but still that's not enough, right? I think the reason is the same thing. So let me bring back another webinar we organize again. Following up with the self-defense webinar, we have a national champion come, Mary, wonderful young lady and black belt, to teach us the self-defense. By the way, I need to practice a little bit more because we wanted to find a solution, right? Not just talk about it. It's like, how can we serve our community? So then CAFA organized a webinar just 2 weeks ago, less than 2 weeks ago, conversation with the law enforcement, including a Chapel Hill police chief, who is wonderful, and Carrie, director of public safety, and also FBI agent from Charlotte. So I share with the data with them. I was called under duty for like 24 hours. Lily, can you help with this? I said, well, wait a minute, what is this about? But anyway, I was very grateful that we have the data from a week prior, the data that we collected on the pre-survey. So I showed it to them, and all 3 of them in the audience said, wow, we have never realized the extent of the issues and how it affected me. But the interesting thing is this, that's what I'm trying to get to. So I said, Peggy, you already did your homework. The hate crime has to be increased nationally, right? And by 150% by Stop AAPI Hate. But national overall hate crime has decreased. I didn't remember what's the number. So I asked them, one of the questions the audience asked is that, have you seen any hate crimes in Cary or Chapel Hill? They said there were 0 hate crimes or hate crimes against Asian American the past year during the pandemic. So, and that's the data they have, right? But think about it, I was very surprised, but kind of not surprised because of the low report rate, because of the barriers, and because of, how do you define racism? It's just really, really hard to define, right? So then if you have watched the news, you watched a recent, there is an incident just last month in the Cary Greenway. I don't know if you watched the news at WIRL or somebody, that there is a jogger who definitely commit a violent crime. We thought it was a hate crime. First, he spit on a Middle Eastern man on their face, then grabbed a Chinese elderly, physical assault in front of the family, and also told the daughter. See, this is very scary. And I walk on that greenway all the time. So you ask me if I experienced that. I didn't personally. Does that affect me? Absolutely. I got scared. Now I don't want to go after 7 o'clock. And it's always on my mind. Even my daughter will say, Mom, don't go. Or, I'm making sure my phone is working. But again, back on my point again. And then also the aggressor told the daughter, go home. So, and it was taped. And it was all these, evidence was caught by the TV. And then the Cary Safety Department said, after thorough investigation, they decided that it was not a hate crime. It's not a hate crime against Asian American. So, obviously, I'm sure they did their best. I'm sure that they follow whatever the procedure is. They did the best they can that they know, right? Just like a George Floyd's case. And when was the last time a policeman was convicted? It took that many years, right? So it's the same thing here. It's just so, the sad part is you knew this is happening in our community. You have the data. You felt it. You heard it. But no, there was no data. You can't even place a charge against this person. Or Atlanta shooting. I mean, I'm sure that we're going to talk about that. Oh, it's not a hate crime. It's it's the same thing.
Right.
So I guess, it is just it's just like a really difficult to know. I think the audience was like a really not happy with the result, but I have to say, you know what, we really appreciate the great work you're doing. I'm sure you did the best you can, and but I think that the point that I was trying to make is that it doesn't matter how you define that crime. It matters is it affect our community, affect how I feel or how I act, how I live. It affected my mental health, and the impact is there.
Absolutely. Well, that was very eloquent, a very eloquent assessment of a heavy emotionally and complicated issue. There is a lot of ambiguity in how we define things and how they measure things. And it's very big-hearted of you to give the police credit. People do what they know, they do their best, and change is a slow process in many areas. Lots of accolades in the chat box. I just want to bring to your attention that you're all, appreciating your insight and your talent and your willingness to bring this to light and share so much of yourself. So thank you for that. And please be sure, I'll copy the chat and send it to you as well. But there's a lot of wonderful feedback that's appreciating all that you're bringing here tonight with us. And you did mention the Atlanta shooting, so let's go to that. It was a mass shooting targeting Asian massage businesses. Afterward, the shooter cited sex addiction as the reason, his motive for the shooting. He was removing temptation from his life. The police initially discounted race as a factor because they took that at face value. What was wrong with that assessment? Let's break that out. And I have that as a Jennifer question.
Yeah. Oh my God. This question is just full of trauma and like complexity. Like there's no space to even get to his identification as a Southern Baptist and like a practicing Christian and like other things. Right now, let's just focus on what is wrong with the assessment that it was not a race thing. Like, oh my God.
Where do you start?
My heart is racing because it's just such an important question. I think it's impossible to discount race as a factor in any decision or behavior, just broadly speaking, because each of us has been brought up in a white supremacist society, and that system of values is so deeply entrenched in everything we're exposed to. It's seeped deep into our subconscious, and it influences our instinctual response. So in the case of the shooter, I'm definitely not surprised that he would deny that it was a racially motivated hate crime. Just because someone denies that they were being racist doesn't mean that they weren't. I think that's a ridiculous assumption. And it's actually like, I think I can't do justice to this question, I think. But I do want to talk a bit about racial gaslighting, because I think that is what this question is hinting at. And I imagine that many people in the audience today have experienced racial gaslighting. I think it would be really helpful to talk about it as a term. For people who are less familiar with it, I actually was not familiar with it until very recently. Gaslighting is a term that's used to describe manipulative and psychologically abusive behavior. Typically, people use it to describe romantic relationships, but it is when one person consistently twists the truth and forces the other person to question what actually happened and make them feel like they're being unreasonable or unrealistic. And so, as you can imagine, racial gaslighting is very similar. It's actually the same. The point of gaslighting is to undermine and make a person question their own judgment, perception, or memory. And it makes the victim question their judgment on issues of racism too. I feel like the Atlanta shooting is just the most tragic manifestation of racial gaslighting. But I feel like it's a common everyday thing too. So one common example is when someone says, oh, like this thing happened, but it's only a few bad apples. Like it's just like an individual thing. There's no systemic thing going on. And this is a coded way of telling a person of color that their experiences of systemic discrimination did not happen, and that instead they were just, you know, like flukes, individual, unconnected incidents. I've heard this taken further, especially when somebody just, you know, leaps onto a moral high ground and is like, I know better than you. So for example, I complained about like a month ago, which is like not that recent, but I complained to a couple of friends about an incident where I had shared some tangyuan, which is a sticky rice dessert filled with black sesame paste. It's like a home like comfort food for me. So I shared this with my classmates, and one of them said, the inside is great, but the outside is like snot. And so, yeah, right, Peg? Like I see your face,
Wow.
appreciate it. So that's not what I'm talking about here. I vented to my friends about how awful this made me feel, and that for the past few years since it happened, I couldn't help but wish that classmate ill. Like, quite simply, I'm just telling you a classic example of a person of color experiencing a microaggression and venting to her friends about it. But now I'm going to tell you how this ties to racial gaslighting. One of my friends I was venting to was very supportive, but the other one cut me off and said, don't you think you're being passive aggressive? And I did not know what to say, so I just stayed silent. I was just like shocked. And he went on, he said it was like snot, not that it was snot. And I was just like, what are you talking about? And he wasn't even being funny or ironic. He was absolutely serious. Like he was taking a moral high ground, first dismissing the comments and denying that it was a microaggression. I don't think it even occurred to him that it was a racially charged microaggression. And second, he was saying that I was being passive aggressive while I was venting to friends I had trusted before in a space that I had thought safe, with no effects, physical, psychological, emotional, on the aggressor. So that's like a funny example of racial gaslighting. And to be honest, I cried in the bathroom right after he said that. I just withdrew into the bathroom. I cried, I went home, I cried some more. So like people don't really understand the effects of a simple comment like that, but it's a lot. And so I have another example. I don't know if we have enough time to get to it. Peg, do you think we're good?
Go ahead. We're running a little longer with the interview, but it's been so insightful, and I think it's great. And I appreciate your vulnerability and sharing something so powerful. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. The other example I have not fully processed yet. It happened just yesterday when I was in class. And I will say that it is such a challenging one. It's very complicated. We were talking about trauma specifically in this class. And one of my classmates said that he felt that the George Floyd trial, with the conviction this past week of Derek Chauvin, was being politically weaponized. And he didn't say what weaponized meant, or like what politically it was being weaponized against. But I kind of inferred that he was criticizing the Black Lives Matter movement. And he also said that he wished people would just move past it and focus on, quote, healthy interracial relationships around us, like the ones he enjoyed in his personal life. And so I know. And when I told him how wrong that felt, he did what I would understand most people would do if they were confronted. He became very defensive. I wish he had paused and considered why his words were so upsetting, but instead he explained that he was part of an interracial family with 5 Black siblings, and
they're all crying in the bathroom, probably.
Yeah, I mean, that's very possible. Like my friends didn't know that I cried in the bathroom at that time, and like I don't know. And so like, what is wrong with this picture? It's very complicated, but I would say that 1, being close to Black people or any people of color does not justify your views as anti-racist. And in fact, 2, it makes it all the more shocking to criticize Black Lives Matter and neglect systemic racism. So these are just a couple of examples from my own experience, and it's very limited in scope and breadth and depth. But going back to the Atlanta shooting, beyond the point that it was absurd for the police to discount race as a factor just because the shooter said so, it also serves as an example of racial gaslighting at the level of law enforcement, which is really scary. And it totally connects with what Lily shared about how police have treated data and reports of very blatant racist violence. So I hope that my sharing these 2 examples today and just my take on the question is helpful in some way, whether in showing people that they're not alone in their experiences of racial gaslighting. I actually just stumbled upon this term very recently, and it's been really helpful. And I also hope that it challenges people to acknowledge times when they've perpetrated it themselves. Even like, I'm not innocent. I've also perpetrated it against people, and it's been another story, another challenge entirely to confront that. So yeah.
Well, again, I appreciate your candor and your vulnerability, and that helps us understand what these microaggressions do and why they have power. We may not realize it's part of a larger fabric of racism that wraps around the person's experience that we can't see. And I hadn't heard the term racial gaslighting before either. So thank you for teaching us that. And Lily. You're on mute.
Do you, I am aware of time, so do you want to move to another question, or do you want it to me to, it is a very loaded question, Jennifer, you have expressed it. So I can feel your pain, so.
Sure. Maybe you could talk about the intersectionality of gender and race.
Okay. So you know what? Actually, I shared with Jennifer before that I have never even heard about intersectionality like until like several weeks ago. So we are all learning, right? All these things. Gaslighting is the first time I heard too. Jennifer, thank you for teaching us. So I would just say, I don't know if I can understand this right, but my understanding is that I think that we each have a different roles, right? So we're women, we're teacher, we're mom, we're Asian American, we're Chinese American. I'm also, community organizer. I'm all these roles. So it depends on where you are, the context, like where you are, then it will define your kind of power, or what is appropriate, what is not appropriate, right? So so I will go back to the Atlanta shooting. So Jennifer, please help me because I wasn't, I didn't know if I got this question right. But like, go back to the Atlanta shooting, right? So they sexualize Asian American women, and I think my understanding is that intentionally and not intentionally, but it's shifting away from the racism, right? This guy has mental illness and sexualized, and so that in itself is wrong. Asian American, where there are sex workers and there are a vulnerable population, but these women are not sex workers. They are massage therapists. They are like business owners, and they are that. So that itself is profiling. Like when you think about Asian American in the spa, then they are the sex workers, right? So, and that itself is wrong. Profiling again, that's a racist. And then about like Asian American women, and then I will have to say that there are minority of women of color, actually, then we are subject to another layer of our power. Actually, the power hierarchy is even less, because I will have to say, like, Asian country, even Chinese country, is a very patriotic culture. And then the women, the babies, like the female babies a long time ago, not very too long ago, are not preferred. So that's all I'm going to say, right? So they place on the boys and they are not on the women. So that we then, as an Asian American woman, even within our own community, does that make sense? So this is different context. And that has that's why I'm very grateful for the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation leadership training to help me process that, different sectors and different roles, and how we, within the context of different roles or intersections that you're in, and then there are different challenges, and also different types of stereotypes or expectations or lack of expectations for you. So so I would just say, because it's a sex and women, so that's, I would say, these are kind of challenges that I will have to say, as much as I love my family, the community organization I work for, and that layer of patriarch, what's the word?
Patriarchy.
Yeah, I'm using a Chinese word now. Did you see? So
All right.
yeah, 大男子主义, I experienced that. It was so funny. One day that we were in one of the board meetings, and one of the board member, who's a female, she goes, I just wanted to point out a fact that how come you address, I didn't know that, I left already. How come you address Lily just as Lily and not Miss Chen, but you address other, board members as Mr. So-and-so, Dr. So-and-so. You know what I mean? But I think this is just like a very complex. These are people that I love to work with, or even like some family members. But again, these are kind of the struggles that I personally, I'm sure that, as a, each one of us has struggled. Sometimes I got so confused. Should I feel like I'm fighting all the time? Who am I fighting with? I don't want to fight with my friends or my family. You know what I mean? But at the same time, I think it is our responsibility to bring the awareness to it, so that people will be more sensitive about it, right? So we don't say it, they're just going to keep saying it. Oh, so and so is just so moody, or you're just like, or like, bossy girls, and similar things like that, or they just automatically just like has some sort of expectations. But anyway.
Right. And it is one more layer of difficulty that makes it hard for people to speak their truth. Jennifer, I noticed you unmuted. Tell us what you have to say.
Oh, I was just putting some more background information into the chat just to contextualize what Lily was saying. I guess I would just emphasize in this interview that the intersectionality has grown in its significance, and now it's being used to really advocate for people at the margins and who aren't served by maybe broader civil rights movements. So, for example, intersectionality originated to describe the experience of Black women who may not be fully served solely by anti-racist movements or feminist movements. And that really does apply to Asian American women, to queer Asian Americans, to like all sorts of people who have these multiple political and social identities. And so when we think about how we can respond to oppression, it is so crucial to think about intersectionality and to think in intersectional terms. So I've put a little bit into the chat, but yeah, so that's all I'll say right here for the sake of time.
Well, thank you for that context. Excuse me, I can see. I'm sorry, I was drinking water and I went down the wrong pipe, so I know my voice sounds funny now. This has been such a fascinating interview for me. I just feel this energy of ideas opening up and increased understanding, and I really appreciate you both so much. Normally we would show our video of the week, but since I really wanted to get as much as we could from our interview time, we're going to pass on that. Pardon me. But I will quickly give our shout outs to mental health intern Patience Gregg, who helps us out on the chat box, psychiatric nurse Gail Pruitt on the chat box and on Facebook Live, and executive director Gary Kreitz for always being there. Also, thank you for all the wonderful comments from our virtual studio audience, Sujaya, Luca. I'm sure I'm not getting everyone, so I won't try, but thank you for helping to make this conversation more broad and more meaningful. So now we're going to switch to our questions. We've got 3 lined up in the Q&A box. Please put your questions in the Q&A box. If you put it in the chat box, it scrolls away and it's much easier for me to miss it, and we don't want to miss your question. So from Gail to Jennifer, does that early recognition of racial bias come from biology, physiology, parental influence, or both?
That's a great question, and I need to go back to the original source, but I'm pretty sure that it's not a biological thing. It is a socializing thing. So I would hypothesize that it is the behavior of parents and families influencing children at that early of an age. But I could be wrong. I definitely need to check this and get back to you somehow, or I don't know, maybe one of our helpers, like one of our team, can put in a link to the original quote if there's time.
Okay. And I could also connect you afterwards if that's helpful.
That'd be great.
And Lily, did you want to add on to that, or?
I'm not sure. So I would think that, again, I can use my personal example. My oldest, who spoke all Chinese before she was 3 years old and went to the preschool, then she was silent for the entire 3 months. Silent, just no words. So she was very bubbly when she was home. And then when she went to preschool, there was all English speaking, right? So, I remember teachers kept asking me what kind of child, it was she. I said, she's very open-minded, she's very bubbly, very social, and she's complete. So I would imagine, again, we didn't know better. So I would imagine she must have felt that she was so different and she just shut down as young as 3-year-old. And so when she went to kindergarten, so she stopped speak Chinese altogether. because she didn't want to be different. So again, and then so when I share with you about like how my two older daughters experience, microaggression and all that, and then I feel very guilty as a parent. I just kept asking them. I said, "Why didn't you tell mommy?" And my oldest daughter said, "I didn't know what it was." So they can't label them. They can't identify them. So I would say yes, at least preschool age, they started to know that they're different. I'm not sure about 6 months or younger, but my personal experience, absolutely, the preschool can start that. That's why I think the education about this about your children as a parent. I know that we don't have too many Chinese parents here, but I have been to different shows, interviews, Cantonese and Mandarin both, and that's what I kept telling the parents, just spending time asking them, and also active listening, no judgment, because we really, there are a lot of things we just didn't know, and it's such a cultural difference between the two generations. So yeah, that would be my comment.
Well, thank you for telling us about that. And that is a dramatic story. I'll be thinking about that. I can tell I'm going to carry that around with me for a little while. Next question is from Gary. Edward Said argued that Westerners typically simplify all Asian cultures and nations into one overarching category called Oriental in order to justify their oppression, their otherness. To what degree has violence against Asian Americans this last year been directed primarily toward Chinese Americans, or have all Asian Americans been targeted as a monolithic group?
I guess I can use again another example. There is a Korean American in Texas who is running for a congressional seat. Okay, I forgot her name. I didn't want to say her name anyway. So she had made a comment that I don't want any Chinese American, a Chinese immigrant in my state in Texas. So there are definitely, I would say, and then she goes, I cannot be racist because I'm Asian American, right? That was the same thing that Jennifer's example said. I have five black brothers. That's why I cannot be able, but bias, unconscious bias, is in every one of us. We all had that. We all can be racist. Just to be honest, right? It's about education, and it's about intentional, unintentional. Also, it's about education. Also, it's about kindness as well, right? But anyway, so Chinese American has definitely been targeted because of the virus, and because it didn't help the President Trump make those rhetoric. And also, I sympathize with all Asian Americans. In Texas, there were young Asian American family have two little kids were physically assaulted in Sam's Club. The father and two young kids, they're from Hmong. They're Hmong. I believe it's East Asian. They're Hmong because they were mistaken as Chinese. They don't care, you know. So if it weren't for Zach Owen stepping up to save them, one of the Sam's employees, a white male, to step up as a bystander, intervene, and stop the weapon, which is a knife, this young father and two children may really hurt more or even die. That's exactly what the father said. So Zach Owen and eventually went to Congress to testify. This is a hate crime. There's no, because the attacker just yelling a Chinese virus, you go home. There's no ambiguity there. But so that example also tells you it doesn't matter you're from China or not. If you're Asian face, you're all Chinese. Vincent Chen, who was mistaken as Japanese, 50 or some years ago, Luca wrote two op-ed about it. So she was Chinese American, mistaken as Japanese American, so that he was beaten to death in Detroit, right? So I will bring up a broader perspective than even like a little bit, going out of our Asian American field is like we all, there's such a complex issue about race. It really is. I'm just learning every day that there are this concept, this notion that in the Asian American community or in Chinese American community, they think that I'm not, they have the sense of a superiority because, they have a good job, we're, educated or, whatever. So therefore, we should be treated as upperclassmen, like quote unquote white. But I'm not saying that I would never said what people should think or should behave, and that's their right and their thinking, right? But the issue of it is that there's such a thinking is that when you wanted to distinguish yourself, we are people of color, we're a minority, right? No matter how hard you try, when there's another Japanese internment camp or Chinese Exclusion Act 100 years ago, they don't care your occupation. They profile you based on your race. It doesn't matter where you work as a Japanese American. You all go to the internment camp. So I want to take this opportunity just, it's a very complex issue. Again, I think that I have had a very difficult conversation with one of my best friends, was a lady friend who is a Christian as well. She just didn't get it. She said, Lily, I see you as a beautiful Asian woman Christian. Because I told her how painful it was being an Asian American. I always see you as my sister in Christ, but blah, blah, blah. So, then I said, which means that I think she said that as a white woman, I don't feel safe either working down the street right now because I'm being attacked. But what she didn't, again, she's a dear friend of mine, right? Of course, she didn't try to hurt me, but it's just the lack of education or ignorance that all of us have. But what she didn't understand is that how can I be a Christian woman and Asian American, having my own experience and struggles and challenges that being just recognized? Basically, she was invalidating because she was an Asian American woman, so she didn't understand what I went through, and she couldn't possibly understood. But doesn't mean that I didn't go through it. Does it make sense? So with that level of, friendship and love, so what I decided to do is like, let's not talk about this until we see each other again. We really can have a long conversation. It's not like this interview is really difficult to have, like an hour and a half, which is very generous already of your time, but it's really a complex issue and it happens. So I think the reason I wanted to say that is that we definitely wanted to validate individual differences or experiences or feelings and all that. That's all real to each individual. That we have a unique, especially people of color, minority. Also, I have to say that a lot of people don't intentionally to try to hurt people. You know what I mean? Like I wouldn't say, I would say give people a benefit of doubt. Sometimes they just didn't, because I make plenty of mistakes saying stupid things. I said, oh my gosh, I couldn't believe I just said that in my classroom to the student. Right. But we just didn't know. But I say that, but I think I do though, everybody should be able to at least could just listen without making judgment or making invalidate somebody's feelings. You know what I'm saying? Perhaps, I don't know if that's too much to ask, because I saw the question, what can we do, like as Asian American, like supporting of Asian American. So I think that just listen, and it's okay to say, I don't quite understand what you're going through, and I don't quite understand how you feel. I couldn't possibly know how you feel, but I'm willing to listen, know more about it. So, and that's what Miss Purin would say. Like that's what teaches student is like, um, therapeutic communication and in empathy, basically, right? So, and then also I will think that we will just start from education and extending grace to others with the benefit of doubt and to yourself too, because sometimes you fight. We do need to call it out, but sometimes we do need to remember that we were given grace as well, and then we do need to give people benefit of doubt. So that's, I think, our slogan last year when we did the Foot of Love during the AAPI month is combat hate with love. You know what I'm saying? So we
Love that.
yeah. So yeah, I wrote down my op-ed as well. So that's part of it. So anyway.
Wow. Well, thank you for so many inspiring words, both of you. We do have one more question, but as you've been talking, it's occurring to me that we live in an era, first of all, where moments of racism are caught on tape, and so we're all confronted with it, and where more people are finding their voices. So it is a time, there's a cacophony of people who have found their voices, and we need to be accepting and extend grace and understand, I've had a life of privilege in that way. And, my white skin has saved me from certain types of harassment and oppression. And I need to be aware of that. And I need to open my heart and my mind to really hear people. Let me get to this last question. What are some of the most helpful words to hear after the Atlanta shooting and other anti-Asian acts of violence?
That's such a good question. I feel like there were no words for that moment. I suppose that just a simple "I'm here for you" was good. But quite honestly, at that time, I had a lot of friends texting just to check in, and I'm very grateful for that. I think at that time, the most helpful thing that was in the messages was, please don't feel any pressure to respond. I was like, oh, thank God. Like it's just so considerate. But after a few days, I think there were still no words. But it was actually, I just went to a friend's place to study and to write. And he just ended up cooking dinner for me. And it just so happened to be H Mart, like scallion pancakes and dumplings. And he's like a very tall white man. I was like, oh, this is really unexpected. But that was so healing. Coincidentally, this was also a few days before this friend and like the other friend who was like, oh, it's not like snot, like that happened. But it doesn't matter who anyone is, like their racial identity. It's that act of care and thoughtfulness that really counts. So yeah.
And Lily?
Yeah, I will echo that. I think it just comes down to all these racism, bullying. It comes down to really kindness. We just need to be kind and extend grace to others and be more loving. So, and I also wanted to use the synergy of, because I used to work at schools as a school nurse for about 10 years, very part-time. We all know that if there's one child have allergies, the entire class cannot bring, like a peanut allergy, right? So an entire class cannot bring peanut, or it has to be a peanut-free zone, right? So these physical allergies, people understand, but psychological allergies, like racism, mental illness, people can't see. But I think I would like to see the same level of sensitivity and kindness to extend to those individuals who are struggling with this unseen challenges or trauma, being racism or bullying or disability or mental illness. So just sensitive, yeah, being sensitive.
Right. All right. Well, that brings us right to the end of our program. Again, I want to thank you, Lily and Jennifer, for sharing so much time with us tonight, but also speaking from the heart, speaking from the head. It's been such a helpful conversation to me, and I'm very grateful to both of you for being here. Please join us, virtual studio audience, and of course, Lily, Jennifer. Next week, we've got a really neat show on autism, life on the spectrum. I've got a handful of professionals that will be on hand and lived experience folks as well. I know you'd really enjoy it. Also, please fill out the survey that magically appears when you close out of this Zoom session. It helps us improve over time, and it also helps us to show our funders the value of what we do and that people actually appreciate it. And in the meantime, go where you need to go, wherever that is, to be safe in the weeks ahead, and take care of yourselves. Thanks, everyone. I'm going to save this chat. Have a wonderful night.
Yeah, thank you so much, Peggy. It has been giving us a space to talk about. It's very healing, and thank you for taking time, inviting us. That was, you're such a great host. I wish I can listen to more Thursday with NAMI. Every time I heard, it was incredible. Thank you for the great work you're doing.
Oh, thanks to you. Thank both of you so much for being so generous with everything. So I'll send you a link to the recording and the survey results in a little while. Have a great night.
Okay, bye-bye.
Lovely to meet you, Jennifer. Lovely to see you, Lily.
Yeah, okay.
So wonderful to
Same
meet you.
here. Have a great night.
Bye.